It started as just another Tuesday night on Jimmy Kimmel Live, but what happened next shocked the nation. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood up to Jimmy Kimmel on live TV, she didn't just defend her beliefs, she ignited a movement and gave voice to millions who've been laughed at, ignored, and silenced for years. Her mic drop shattered the studio and the internet. So, what really happened that night? And how did one woman's truth bring late-night comedy crashing to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was a Tuesday night like any other, or at least that's what the audience believed as they filed into the bright, climate-controlled studio of Jimmy Kimmel Live. Stage lights burned with the intensity of a summer sun, pulsing in rhythm with the jazzy opening theme. The crowd, a mix of tourists and locals, clapped on cue, their laughter ready, their expectations low, a few cheap jokes, a celebrity appearance, maybe a political jab or two. Nothing too serious, nothing too real. But behind the curtain, destiny had already loaded its chamber. The producers whispered into headsets. The floor manager counted down. And in walked Jimmy Kimmel, all charm and confidence, the kind that comes from years of mocking others without consequence. He approached the camera with that practiced smirk, unaware that he was seconds away from stepping into the most explosive moment of his career. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice rising with mock drama, "tonight's guest is someone who brought her lawyer brain into Congress and somehow still thinks logic belongs in politics." Laughter spilled out like a reflex, loud but uneven. He continued, undeterred, "Please welcome Jasmine Crockett, criminal defense attorney, Congresswoman, and apparently the new spokesperson for Spin." There were cheers, sure, but also a few glances exchanged in the crowd. Some smiles faltered. The tone had shifted. And then she appeared. Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the stage not like a guest, but like a warning. Her tailored navy blue suit caught the light and held it. Her walk was measured, composed. She didn't wave. She didn't smile wide. She simply advanced, with the same quiet force she might use walking into a courtroom where the stakes were life and death. Her face was calm, but unreadable. This wasn't her first hostile room. She had stood in front of juries that didn't want to believe her clients deserved a second chance. She had faced off with prosecutors who bent rules and reporters who twisted her words. And tonight she was ready to face a comedian armed with a script, a camera, and a crowd trained to laugh before they think. As she neared Jimmy, a flicker passed through his eyes, small but visible, a flash of calculation, maybe even doubt. She extended her hand without hesitation, and he took it. The grip was brief but deliberate, like two boxers touching gloves before a round. Jimmy tried to reclaim the rhythm. "So, Jasmine, you didn't bring your gavel, did you?" He joked, hoping to draw another laugh. She gave him half a smile. Sharp, cold, unreadable. No comeback. No chuckle, just silence that settled like tension in a courtroom. She sat down slowly, legs crossed, shoulders squared, gaze locked on him with surgical precision. She looked more like a litigator than a guest, more like a judge than a target. The camera panned over the audience. Some faces still held smiles, others began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Something was different. The mood, the energy, the air itself, it all felt like the seconds before thunder. They had come expecting laughs. They weren't ready for a reckoning. They weren't ready for her. But before the air had a chance to settle, Jimmy struck the first blow, carefully veiled in comedy, sharpened with precision, and tossed like a pebble that he knew would ripple far wider than it seemed. He turned to the camera with that familiar gleam in his eye, a performer in total command of his stage. "So," he began, his voice light but loaded, "you came all the way from the White House. Hope you didn't need GPS to find your way through a straight answer." The line dropped like bait, slick and rehearsed, a clever little dig meant to draw laughter and tilt the playing field before the first real question was even asked. And it worked, at least for a moment. Laughter exploded through the studio, the kind of loud, reflexive noise that came more from expectation than amusement. They were trained for it, conditioned to respond on cue. Cameras panned over the crowd, capturing gleaming smiles, hands clapping, heads thrown back in orchestrated delight. Jimmy leaned into it, feeding off the energy, assuming, wrongly, that he had control. But on her side of the stage, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not a blink, not a breath out of rhythm. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't scoff. She didn't rush to respond or offer a forced laugh to diffuse the moment. No, she sat in perfect stillness, her body calm, her gaze steady. Her back was straight as a steel rod, shoulders square, head tilted just slightly, not in deference, but in calculation. Her lips parted, just enough to let the faintest curve show. Not a smile, not quite, but something colder. A micro-expression, a warning. She wasn't caught off guard. She was watching, analyzing, reading the room like a chess master reading a board mid-match. Her silence wasn't passive, it was tactical. It was the silence of a trial lawyer letting an opponent dig their own grave before submitting the first piece of evidence. A silence shaped by years of being underestimated, dismissed, mischaracterized, and then walking away with the win anyway. Around the studio, the energy began to change. Not all at once. Not loudly, but subtly, like pressure shifting before a storm. In the back rows, a few older men leaned forward in their seats. They weren't laughing. They weren't smiling. Their arms were folded, their brows slightly furrowed. They had seen that kind of look before. It wasn't the look of someone unprepared. It was the look of someone who had been through fires the rest of the room couldn't begin to imagine. Someone who had argued cases no one else would touch. Someone who had built credibility the hard way, argument by argument, truth by truth. And now she was being reduced, before she'd spoken a single full sentence, to a joke. And still Jasmine said nothing. The lights caught the edge of her cheekbone. Her fingers rested calmly on her knee, her nails trimmed, her suit unwrinkled, her presence undiminished. Jimmy was still smiling, still soaking up the moment, unaware that the woman seated just a few feet away had already taken command of the room, not through volume, but through presence, through restraint, through a kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. She had felt this dynamic 100 times before, where men laughed to keep control, where charm was used to disarm, where mockery was the first weapon deployed to put a woman back in her place. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing that game. She wasn't there to soften the mood or to let the audience get comfortable before she began speaking truth. She was there to dismantle the script, and the silence that followed Jimmy's joke, that sharp, waiting silence, was the first crack in the floor beneath his feet. The silence had weight, but Jimmy wasn't listening. He mistook it for hesitation instead of calculation. And like a man too confident in his own rhythm, he stepped right into the next punch without realizing he'd already been countered. "So, Jasmine," he said, settling deeper into his chair with a grin that was more blade than smile, "when you look at gas prices spiking, inflation climbing higher than my ratings during election season, and groceries costing more than a night at this show, do you honestly think this administration has done anything right for the American people?" His tone was light, almost playful, but the words came like bullets, fast, sharp, deliberate. It wasn't curiosity. It was an ambush wrapped in a punchline. He didn't want answers. He wanted applause. He wanted her on defense before she even had a chance to breathe. "I mean," he continued, shrugging casually as if stating the obvious, "at this rate, the only thing more inflated than prices is the president's ego." The audience laughed on cue, though the laughter was thinner now, forced in some places, uncomfortable in others. Jimmy's eyes scanned the room, searching for confirmation, validation. He gestured broadly, hands animated, voice rising as if sheer volume could make the question more legitimate. He didn't pause to listen. He didn't need to. In his mind, the point had been made. But for Jasmine, the weight of that question was something else entirely. It wasn't just about gas prices or grocery bills. It was about being forced once again to wear the face of every failing, every frustration, every economic burden she didn't create. He was demanding answers, but not from the institutions that caused the crisis, not from the billion-dollar corporations hiking prices, not from the broken systems that had been failing people long before her name was known. No, he was demanding them from her, A black woman in a navy suit sitting under hot studio lights, expected to carry not just the narrative, but the blame. She wasn't there as herself anymore. She had been turned into a symbol, a target, a scapegoat in real time, under the guise of comedy. She knew this moment. She'd seen it in courtrooms, in hearings, in interviews where the questions were never neutral, and the jokes were always daggers. Jimmy wasn't debating, he was performing. And the cost of that performance, as always, would fall squarely on her shoulders. Still, she didn't move. She didn't blink. Her expression didn't crack. But behind her stillness, something was shifting. Subtle, precise, powerful. Like a lever being pulled in silence. Like a storm gathering just beyond the edge of visibility. He thought he'd cornered her with laughs. What he didn't see was that she'd already begun building her response, brick by unshakable brick. And when she chose to speak, it wouldn't be just a reply. It would be a reckoning. He thought she'd fold under the weight of the setup, but Jasmine Crockett didn't fold. She calibrated. The laughter had faded, the smug grin across Jimmy's face lingering a second too long, just enough to be noticeable. Jasmine inhaled once, slow and deep, as if sealing something inside her chest. Then she moved, barely, straightening in her seat, uncrossing and recrossing her legs, with the kind of poise that came not from performance, but from years of being the only calm voice in rooms built to silence her. And when she spoke, her tone didn't rise. It lowered, cooled, condensed into a controlled burn. "Let's start with facts, Jimmy," she said, her voice crisp and deliberate, each word placed like evidence on a table. The U.S. Department of Labor reported unemployment at 3.5%. That's not a guess. That's not a spin. That's the lowest we've seen in 50 years. The room went still, not out of discomfort, but because something had shifted. She wasn't answering. She was commanding. Jasmine didn't stop to check if the audience was with her. She didn't need them to be. She was speaking the way she argued in court, methodical, composed, undeniable. "We've added 2.3 million manufacturing jobs since restructuring trade and supply policies. Jobs in steel, in tech fabrication, in auto assembly. Not gigs, not side hustles, real jobs with real paychecks." Her delivery was like a litany, steady, grounded, built on the bones of reports and raw numbers. "I know it's easier to make jokes about high gas prices than to explain why oil gets more expensive when there's a war in another part of the world," she said, turning to face Jimmy, her eyes steady and clear. "But acting like the White House controls every price at the gas pump or every item in the grocery store? That's not smart. It's just not true. And honestly, people deserve the truth, not another punchline." Her voice didn't shake. It grew sharper, tight and firm, like a rope pulled to its limit, ready to snap back. By the time she finished, the studio had gone breathless. The only sound was the gentle hum of stage lights overhead, like a courtroom's fluorescent flicker just before a verdict is read. Jasmine sat back, not in retreat but in closure. Her argument made, her point delivered. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't looked for applause, but applause came anyway, first in scattered bursts, then louder, then fuller. It wasn't the kind of clapping you give because a cue light tells you to. It was the kind that comes when someone speaks a truth you've lived with, quietly, without anyone ever putting it into words. Jimmy didn't speak. He blinked once, then adjusted the stack of cards in front of him as if they could shield him from what had just happened. And Jasmine? She simply waited, still, ready, because this wasn't a show for her. It never had been. This was defense. This was war, and she had just landed the first clean strike. The applause hadn't even fully faded before Jimmy reached for his next move. Not with words this time, but with video. It was a pivot that felt rehearsed, like a play he'd run a dozen times before, only now it was dressed up as spontaneity. "And speaking of truth," he said, with a smile too tight to be genuine, "let's take a quick look at one of Jasmine's greatest press room moments." His tone was playful on the surface, but underneath it was loaded with intent. He wasn't building a conversation, he was setting a trap. With a flick of his hand toward the booth, The studio lights dimmed slightly, and the big screen behind them sparked to life. The clip began rolling. The audience leaned in, eyes flicking from screen to stage. Jasmine's image appeared at a White House press briefing, same posture, same calm presence. But something about the clip felt off from the first second. In the footage, she hesitated, just for a breath. She looked down at her notes, adjusted her phrasing, then glanced back up toward the reporters. Her voice faltered slightly as she referenced a policy number, then recovered and moved on. The clip was short, maybe 6 or 7 seconds at most, but it was clipped in a way that made the pause feel longer, the stumble more awkward, the room colder. There was no context, no full exchange, just a freeze frame of vulnerability taken out of time and dropped into this theater of mockery. A few members of the audience laughed, a sharp, reflexive burst, but it didn't echo. It didn't catch. The rest of the room sat in a kind of stalled silence, unsure if they were supposed to find this funny or if they just watched someone be undermined on purpose. Jasmine didn't move, not a twitch. She didn't look at the screen. She didn't look at Jimmy. She kept her eyes forward, her face unreadable, her body still, like a statue carved from control. But the stillness wasn't fear. It was fury, contained. She'd been here before. She'd seen moments like this used as weapons, snippets stripped of truth, clipped to humiliate, framed to discredit. It wasn't the first time her voice had been edited to fit someone else's story. Jimmy leaned forward, sensing the silence. "Bit of a rough day, huh?" he said, with a smirk that faltered before it finished. But even he could feel it. The mood had shifted. What he'd meant to be a joke had come off like a low blow. And Jasmine, she hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. The tension in the room spoke for her, and the quiet that followed felt less like hesitation, and more like the moment before the counterstrike. The silence after Jimmy's jab was thick, like the air had changed weight. People were still looking at the screen, maybe waiting for Jasmine to defend herself, maybe expecting her to laugh it off like any other guest would. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, her face calm, her eyes steady. Then came a small, dry laugh, quiet but sharp. It wasn't the laugh of someone who was caught off guard. It was the sound of someone who had seen this playbook before. She turned to Jimmy, slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with him. "Those 5 seconds," she said, her voice even, controlled. "That's not who I am. That's a clip, a moment pulled out of context, cut to make me look unsure." The room was completely silent now. No chuckles, no movement, just tension hanging between them like a wire stretched tight. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words came clearly, every one of them loaded with meaning. "But do you know what is me?" she said. 15 years of standing in courtrooms, arguing for people who didn't have anyone else. 15 years defending people who were wrongly accused, ignored, or just plain forgotten. That's who I am. That's the work I've done. That's the record that matters." Her voice didn't waver. It grew firmer, more grounded with every word. She wasn't angry. She was anchored. And it hit harder than any shout could have. That's when something shifted in the audience. Not all at once, but slowly, like people realizing they'd just seen the game change in front of them. A few older men in the crowd nodded quietly. A woman near the front lowered her phone and looked up, eyes a little wider now. They'd been told to laugh, but now they were listening. And what they heard wasn't a politician dodging blame. It was a woman reclaiming her story. They knew what it meant to be judged for one bad second, one mistake, one clip that didn't show the full picture. They'd lived it. They'd survived it. And Jasmine, in that moment, had just reminded them of their own worth, too. Not with a slogan, not with a soundbite, but with the truth said plainly, boldly, and without fear. The room was still carrying the weight of Jasmine's words, but Jimmy wasn't ready to let it go. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, trying to pull back the attention that had clearly started slipping away. His smile was thinner now, the edges tight, his usual confidence starting to show cracks. "All right," he said, raising his voice slightly, trying to bring the focus back to him. "So you've got your numbers. Impressive. You clearly came prepared." His tone dripped with sarcasm, and he paused just long enough to invite laughter. but only a few people chuckled. Still, he pushed ahead, not giving her room to answer. But while you're busy talking about job stats, maybe take a look outside the White House window. Real people are struggling. They're hurting, and it's because of the very policies you're standing here to defend. The screen behind him changed again. No video this time, just a big headline in bold letters. Middle class squeezed by rising taxes and inflation. Jimmy turned and pointed to it like it was his winning card. You think people care about a graph when their rent just went up again, and buying groceries feels like paying off a loan, he said, voice picking up steam. You think they feel represented when their paycheck's gone by the middle of the month? He leaned back, folding his hands like the conversation was already over. It's hard to celebrate job numbers, he added, when all people see is more bills and more debt. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She stayed quiet, but not because she was unsure. She was listening, watching, waiting. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not with anger, but with focus. She saw exactly what Jimmy was doing. He wasn't just going after policies. He was using the struggles of everyday people, the very people she had spent her life standing up for, as weapons to attack her. He was turning their pain into a joke, a soundbite, something to throw at her for applause. That wasn't just unfair. It was shallow. It was fake. And worst of all, he thought she would just sit there and let it happen. Thought she'd nod, or try to explain it away, or apologize for something she didn't cause. But he didn't understand the kind of woman he was facing. Jasmine Crockett had grown up in hard times, shaped by them, made stronger because of them, and she had no intention of staying silent. But Jimmy's smirk didn't last long, because when Jasmine finally spoke, she didn't just answer. She unleashed. She leaned forward, slow and deliberate, like she was stepping into the space he had just tried to claim. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't rise. But every word hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. You say people are hurting, she said, her tone cool but cutting. Then let's actually talk about what's hurting them. And who's helping? There was no stumble, no pause for effect, only calm precision. We were importing more than 60% of our steel from China for nearly 2 decades. That gutted American towns. Steel plants closed. Whole communities vanished. She paused, but not for approval, only to let the truth settle. Since restructuring our trade agreements, that number's dropped. Domestic steel production is up 25%. That's not theory. That's jobs. That's paychecks. The room had gone quiet again, not the awkward kind from before, but the kind where people listen. She shifted slightly in her seat. Not for comfort, but to get closer, to take control of the space. That factory in western Pennsylvania, it rehired 70 welders last year. That's 70 families that got their health insurance back. That's 70 kitchens with food again. So don't act like these numbers don't mean anything just because you'd rather tell a joke. Her words were like bricks, solid, undeniable. You're right, Jimmy. People are struggling. But struggling doesn't mean stupid, and it sure as hell doesn't mean invisible. That landed. You could feel it. Even the camera seemed to pause before moving again, as if unsure how to frame what was unfolding. And then, without warning, she shifted the tone, lowered it, brought it in closer. Her voice grew quieter, but heavier. Do you know what it feels like to work 3 jobs and still get laughed at by someone who's never missed a meal? Her words were simple now, stripped of stats, built from experience. In Flint, there's a man who works all night loading boxes, then flips burgers during the day, and still cleans hotel rooms on weekends just to cover rent. And when he turns on the TV, you know what he sees? Late-night comedians making fun of the very people who never stop working while the rest of the country shut down. The crowd was dead silent. Not a shift, not a cough, nothing. Just the sound of hard truth settling into soft places. Jasmine didn't stop there. Her eyes stayed locked on Jimmy's, steady, unwavering. You don't have to agree with everything this administration has done. You can challenge policies. That's democracy, she said. But don't sit here from the comfort of a multi-million-dollar studio and act like you speak for the people living this struggle. Because you don't. I've seen them. I've talked to them. I am them. She leaned back slowly, but her words didn't retreat. They hovered, thick in the air. So when you mock the decisions we make to bring jobs back, to protect American industry, to fix decades of damage, you're not mocking me. You're mocking the people who don't have the luxury of laughing back. Something shifted again, not in Jasmine, but in the room. The applause didn't come right away. No one rushed to clap like they were told to. This time it built slowly, starting with a few quiet nods, then swelling into a real, raw wave. It wasn't the applause of entertainment. It was the sound of people realizing they weren't just watching a show anymore. They were witnessing someone speak for them. Jimmy shifted in his seat, jaw tight, tapping a pen that suddenly had nowhere to point. His next joke died on his tongue, because for the first time all night, he wasn't the one in control of the room. Jasmine had taken the moment and flipped it. She had turned his sarcasm into a mirror and forced everyone to look into it. The injustice wasn't just in the content of Jimmy's jab, it was in the assumption behind it, that a working-class American's pain could be boiled down to a punchline. That policy was just politics. That hardship was something to be performed, not lived. And Jasmine, without ever raising her voice, had made it clear that she wasn't there to entertain. She was there to speak the kind of truth that doesn't fit neatly into a monologue. But just as the applause faded and the weight of Jasmine's words seemed to settle over the room like a thick, quiet fog, Jimmy leaned forward, not with a smile this time, not with charm, but with something colder. It wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but it was calculated, and it was meant to draw blood. He tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes like he was offering a personal thought, but the softness in his voice only made the words sting more. "Aren't you tired, Orshridge?" he asked, as if it were concern, not a trap. His voice was low, almost gentle, but it echoed in the studio like a dropped pin in a courtroom. "Tired of defending someone the whole world laughs at? Tired of standing up for a man who's become more late-night material than leader?" He let it hang there, like a blade held just above the surface. "You're sharp, Jasmine. You're tough. But don't you ever wonder if you're just spending your energy covering for someone who's making it all worse?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed in sympathy, a carefully framed suggestion that her loyalty was misplaced, that her strength was being wasted. The crowd didn't laugh this time. They didn't clap. They watched, because everyone in that room could feel it. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was personal. Jimmy had shifted the battlefield. He was no longer attacking her arguments. He was attacking her judgment, her sense of self. He was saying, "You're smart, but maybe not smart enough to know you're being used." And in that moment, the silence wasn't respectful. It was tense. The kind that rises right before impact, when no one dares breathe because they can feel what's coming next. Jimmy thought he was breaking her down, but Jasmine wasn't shrinking. She was getting still, like the eye of a storm, holding back its power, just for a moment longer. But if Jimmy thought that question would corner her, if he truly believed that poking at her loyalty would shake her resolve, then he had no idea who he was sitting across from. Because Jasmine didn't just answer, she stood. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rushed. But the moment she stood up, the whole room shifted. The air felt heavier. People leaned in. Jasmine Crockett didn't just stand to talk. She stood to take control. Her back was straight, her shoulders strong, and her eyes locked right on Jimmy. For the first time all night, he leaned back, not in charge, but unsure. When she spoke, her voice was low and clear. Every word hit with calm power. "You see a joke," she said, steady and sharp. "But I see millions of people, steel workers, truck drivers, veterans, single moms, who are counting on these policies because, for once, they feel like someone is finally fighting for them." There was no anger in her voice, but there was weight behind every word. She wasn't talking about numbers anymore. She was talking about people. You talk about everyday Americans like they're just headlines. "I know them by name," she continued. "I've sat across from them when they say, 'Does anyone in Washington care about what we're going through?' And I've looked them in the eye and said, 'Yes, I do.'" She stepped forward slightly, not to threaten, but to make sure no one missed a single word. "You think this is just about defending someone? No, it's about standing up for people who are always left out of the conversation, who are tired of being ignored." Jimmy didn't speak. He didn't move. The spotlight wasn't on him anymore. Jasmine took a breath and kept going, her voice never breaking. You want to make it all a joke? Fine. That's your job. But where I come from, people aren't laughing. They're just trying to survive. Her tone shifted, softer but more personal. There's a man in Flint, Michigan. He works 3 jobs, loads trucks at night, flips burgers during the day, and cleans motel rooms on weekends. All that just to cover rent and keep food on the table for his daughter. You could feel the silence in the room, thick, heavy. And when he turns on the TV for 5 minutes of peace, what does he see? People laughing at his struggle, like his life is something to mock. That landed hard. You could feel it in the way the audience breathed, slower, deeper, like something real had cracked through the surface. You ask if I'm tired of defending someone people laugh at, she said. I'm tired of people laughing at the ones who don't get to sit in studios or make jokes for a living. I'm tired of people being turned into punchlines just because they can't fight back. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her voice was calm, strong, and completely in control. I stand with the people who work hard, get paid little, and still show up every day. That's who I answer to. And then something happened. Not all at once, but slowly like a wave building. A man in the back row stood up, quietly. No clapping, no shouting, just standing. Then someone else, and another. In a few seconds, nearly half the room was on their feet. Not because they were told to, not because they were impressed, but because they felt something. Something real. Jasmine had said what so many had wanted to say themselves, but couldn't. She didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like someone who had lived through it. Someone who still carried those stories with her. The applause came next. Not wild, not forced, but steady. Rising, deep. It wasn't just for her words. It was for the truth behind them. Jimmy didn't say anything. He looked down at the cards on his desk, but they didn't help him now. Jasmine didn't look for praise. She didn't smile. She just nodded once, almost to herself, like she knew she had done what she came to do. Not to win an argument, but to remind everyone watching that behind every policy, behind every headline, are real people. And they're not jokes. They matter. With the crowd still on their feet, Jasmine reached up and calmly removed her microphone. The motion was slow and steady, and the quiet click of the mic coming loose felt loud in a room that had just been full of shouting. She didn't rush. She didn't look angry. She was completely in control. She placed the mic gently on the table in front of her, not with attitude, not for show, but with the kind of calm that says, I'm done here. Then she looked at Jimmy. Not with hate, not even frustration, just clear, steady focus. I don't need these lights to tell the truth, she said, her voice firm but soft. I just need people who are willing to listen. For a second, the room froze. Everyone just stared. No clapping, no talking, just silence. Then the crowd exploded, not in laughter or polite applause, but something louder, real, honest. It wasn't the sound of people watching a TV show. It was the sound of people realizing they had just seen something real. Something that wasn't part of the script. They weren't just an audience anymore. They were witnesses to a moment that would be remembered. Jasmine wasn't performing. She was standing up for people, and now they were standing up for her. Jimmy sat frozen. His usual grin faded. He looked confused, maybe even a little shaken. He laughed nervously and said, Wait, you're not actually leaving, are you? His voice cracked at the end, like even he wasn't sure what tone to take anymore. Jasmine didn't sit back down. She didn't smile. She looked him right in the eye and said, This stage doesn't define who I am. What I do does. And I came here to speak for the people you joke about, and to speak the truth you try to twist. The air in the room changed again, not from noise, but from energy. Everything slowed. Jasmine turned toward the audience, not to make a scene, but to speak to them. Her voice stayed low, but strong. This isn't about one show or one moment, she said. It's about the way real people get treated like jokes when they're doing everything they can just to stay afloat. They're not punchlines. They're workers, parents, veterans, neighbors. She looked around the room, locking eyes with people in the crowd. And if standing up for them makes me the target of your jokes, so be it. I'll take that hit. But I won't stay silent. One by one, people stood again. This time not out of surprise, but out of respect. Some clapped, some didn't. A few just stood with arms crossed and eyes locked on her like they didn't want to miss a second. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was a moment of truth. Jasmine didn't look for applause. She didn't soak in the spotlight. She just nodded once, almost to herself, like she had said exactly what needed to be said, and she had. Jimmy didn't say anything, not right away. He looked down at the cards in front of him, the ones he usually used to stay ahead of the moment. But they felt useless now. Jasmine turned and calmly walked off stage. No big gestures, no waving, just a quiet, steady exit. The crowd moved to the side as she passed. Some reached out to touch her arm. Others just nodded, eyes wide. They weren't reacting to a guest. They were reacting to a leader, someone who had taken their pain seriously and refused to let it be laughed at. Back at the desk, Jimmy finally tried to recover. He looked into the camera, gave a weak smile, and said, "Well, looks like I need a new closing joke." It didn't land. No laughter, just silence. Because Jasmine hadn't just walked out of the studio, she had taken the moment with her, and now the room didn't feel like a comedy set anymore. It felt like something had changed, because it had. The buzz didn't die down. People pulled out their phones, not to post a funny clip, but to document what they'd just seen. You could hear whispers. "She really left. She said exactly what I've been feeling. That wasn't a guest. That was something else." And Jimmy? He sat quiet at his desk, the lights still hot, the camera still rolling, but the power gone. Jasmine Crockett had walked in as a guest, but walked out as a symbol, not of politics, not of parties, but of truth. She didn't walk out for attention. She walked out to make it clear. Some people speak to entertain. Others speak to remind us what matters. And in one quiet moment, Jasmine did both. By the time Jasmine disappeared behind the studio curtain, the energy in the room hadn't settled. It had ignited. And outside those walls, the fire was only just beginning to spread. It started with a 30-second clip. A phone camera caught her placing the microphone on the desk, heard her final words, "I don't need these lights to speak the truth," and followed her as she walked off stage with quiet, unshaken power. Within minutes, that clip hit Twitter. Within an hour, it was everywhere. By the 8th hour, it had passed 10 million views. Not from marketing, not from media, from people, from steelworkers in Pennsylvania, from teachers in Wisconsin, from veterans in Texas, and truckers crossing through Ohio. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a rupture, a break in the noise, a signal in the static. The hashtag #sign Jasmine Unfiltered shot to #1 globally before sunrise. And this wasn't just a trending joke or meme. This was fuel. Veterans posted the video with captions like, "She spoke with more courage than most politicians I've seen in 20 years. Long-haul drivers shared it between stops, writing, "Finally someone who sounds like they've ridden in this cab." Coal miners, factory workers, single parents, people who rarely felt seen in political discourse, shared her speech with one common message. She said what we've all been thinking, and no one else had the guts to say. It wasn't polished, it wasn't pre-approved, it was real. And that's exactly why it spread like wildfire. On Facebook, the reaction was even deeper. A post from a retired steelworker in West Virginia was shared 80,000 times in one afternoon. He wrote, "My wife and I cried watching her. Not because it was sad, because it was the first time in a long time someone made us feel human again on national television." Comment sections weren't the usual chaos. They were full of quiet stories, about missed paychecks, about working 3 jobs, about sitting in silence while people on TV turned their lives into punchlines. Jasmine hadn't delivered a political speech. She'd lit a fuse beneath a decade of bottled-up frustration, and now the country was hearing it loud and clear. Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel's team was in full panic mode. What had started as a routine interview had become a cultural reckoning, and he was no longer the clever host in charge of the punchline. Less than 12 hours after the show aired, his publicist released a statement. Short, safe. I want to publicly apologize to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. My intention was never to diminish her voice or the people she represents. I respect her service and regret how the interview unfolded. But it was too late. The moment had passed him, and the apology, though necessary, felt hollow to many, like it had come from a man who finally realized the joke had turned on him. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Major headlines read, Crockett walks off Kimmel's stage, walks into American spotlight. Cable hosts debated whether it was bravery or grandstanding. But online, the people weren't debating. They were agreeing. They were pointing to that moment, when she removed the mic, when she said, "This stage doesn't define me. Action does," as something bigger than a media clash. It was clarity. It was conviction. It was everything they hadn't seen in years from anyone in power. And what truly shook the media establishment was this. Jasmine didn't tweet once. She didn't post a statement. She didn't respond to Jimmy or the critics or the praise. She let the moment speak for itself, and the silence from her end made it louder. Every hour the clip was reposted, every time a new person wrote, "She spoke for me," her presence grew, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. This wasn't about going viral. This was about validation, about people who'd felt ignored watching someone finally say, "You matter." Producers who had once brushed off Jasmine as too serious or too policy-driven were now chasing her for interviews. Late-night hosts quietly reviewed their upcoming guest lists. Network executives whispered about risk management. What if another guest doesn't play along? What if they speak like Jasmine did? The system had been cracked open, and the fear wasn't that it broke. It was that the audience liked what they saw. By the time evening came again, reactions had reached the international press. BBC ran a headline, "American lawmaker walks off talk show, sparks national discussion." Al Jazeera called it the most honest 30 seconds in American television this year. And still, Jasmine remained silent. No interviews, no tweets, no victory laps. Because for her, this wasn't about fame. This wasn't about being right. It was about not backing down. It was about reminding millions of people that truth doesn't need approval. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud and walk away when it's done. Back in the studio, Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk the following night, visibly different. He opened with a joke, but his delivery faltered. The laugh track didn't hit. The timing was off. Because once a moment like that happens, once someone takes the spotlight and uses it to speak for the people instead of to them, there's no going back to scripted comfort. The audience had tasted something real. And real always leaves a mark. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She didn't insult. She didn't storm off. She stood, she spoke, and she walked away. And in doing so, she reminded a nation what leadership really looks like. Not noise, not spin, but truth without fear. And now, 10 million views later, a single message echoed across the country. From truck stops to break rooms, from kitchens to quiet front porches. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us. As the digital world kept echoing her words and replaying her quiet exit, reality came calling the next morning. This time not on a soundstage, but on the stone steps of Capitol Hill, where the spotlight wasn't scripted and the stakes were always real. The sun rose over Washington, D.C. with an extra layer of attention. Reporters, activists, and curious citizens crowded the steps outside the Capitol. Cameras were already in place, microphones pointed. Everyone was waiting for Jasmine Crockett. Not the politician they'd seen in hearings, not the legal mind they'd watched at press briefings, but the woman who had, less than 24 hours ago, walked off a late-night comedy stage with nothing but her voice, her values, and a mic she left behind. There was no music, no dramatic entrance. She stepped forward in a navy suit, calm and precise, as if the firestorm online had never happened. But you could feel it, the heat around her, the respect, the tension from those unsure if she'd double down or dial it back. A reporter raised a hand, not shouting, not rude, just curious. "Congresswoman Crockett," he asked, voice clear, "do you think maybe you were too tough last night? Too firm? Too aggressive for a television audience? There was a pause, not from her, but from the crowd, from the air itself. It was the kind of question that so often got asked of women in power. Coded, loaded, disguised as neutral, but aimed like a dart. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. And when she answered, her voice was low, unwavering, and absolutely surgical. I wasn't being tough, she said. I was being clear. And no, I don't fold in the face of cheap laughter. The line sliced through the crowd like a clean verdict. No exaggeration, no rage, just truth. Unapologetic and sharp. Some reporters nodded. Others scribbled, suddenly realizing they weren't covering a controversy. They were covering a shift. Because Jasmine wasn't just defending her actions. She was redefining them. She wasn't speaking for attention. She was anchoring herself to something deeper than ratings. Dignity. And far beyond DC, her words didn't just echo. They ignited. A law student in Atlanta, barely 23, posted a TikTok clip of Jasmine's Capitol Hill statement over footage of her writing briefs in the library. The caption read, "This is the kind of lawyer I want to be, one who doesn't bend for applause or break under pressure." The video hit over 1 million views by midnight. Another student in Chicago stitched her press conference with the comment, "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the bar." Young women studying law, politics, and public speaking began resharing clips of Jasmine's responses, not just for content, but for inspiration. It wasn't about her being famous, it was about her being fearless. And then quietly, a different kind of reaction took hold. In diners, in truck stops, in break rooms across the Midwest, older men, the ones with oil on their hands and pain in their backs, watched the footage too. They weren't reposting, they weren't tweeting, but they were listening. One retired auto worker in Detroit turned to his son after seeing Jasmine's reply and said, "Man, I wish we had more people like her up there." His son nodded, and neither spoke for a while. In a Texas hardware store, 2 men paused in the middle of hauling supplies and played the clip off a phone. One exhaled, low and tired. "She's got spine, real spine." The other said nothing, just nodded and kept the volume up. These weren't people used to being moved by a Capitol Hill press conference. But Jasmine had cracked something open. Not with anger, but with courage. Not by demanding attention, but by refusing to shrink. She hadn't asked for sympathy. She hadn't softened the truth to make it easier to hear. She had stood still while others tried to reduce her to a reaction, and then answered with the kind of calm that demanded people sit up straight and reconsider the rules. Inside the press room, another reporter tried again. This time the tone was different, less probing, more reflective. "Congresswoman," they asked, "do you think what happened last night marks a turning point in how elected officials should respond to being challenged publicly?" Jasmine gave a small smile, not amused but thoughtful. "I think it's a turning point when someone tells the truth without needing to yell," she said. "I think it's a turning point when someone decides not to laugh just because everyone else is." And then she added, with a voice that carried far beyond the podium, "If that's too much for politics, then maybe politics needs to change." It wasn't a mic drop. It wasn't performance. It was a declaration, and it traveled. By mid-afternoon, news networks had shifted tone. What was framed the night before as a heated moment was now being discussed as a cultural reset. Analysts on both sides admitted this wasn't just another viral flash. It was a mirror, and people were staring into it, some in discomfort, others in awe. Jasmine's calm defiance on a comedy show had become a case study in leadership. Her refusal to let her voice be reduced to sound bites had started a conversation that no one could control, and her press conference, direct, clear, and unflinching, cemented the fact that she wasn't riding a wave. She was the wave. Back in DC, Jasmine left the podium without rushing. She didn't linger. She didn't wait for applause. She simply turned, nodded to her team, and walked back toward the Capitol steps. The same way she had left the Kimmel stage, steady, grounded, unchanged by the storm swirling around her. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't enter rooms to impress. She entered them to remind the powerful that courage isn't loud, but it is lasting. To remind the forgotten that they aren't alone. and to remind everyone watching that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not sit back down. And as she disappeared into the marble shadows of Congress, one thing was clear. She had spoken in a voice the nation couldn't unhear. And no matter what came next, no matter how politics tried to spin it or bury it, Jasmine had already made history. Not with anger, not with ambition, with truth. Spoken plainly, stood on solid ground, and heard by everyone. As Jasmine stepped back into the halls of Congress, the world still buzzing from her quiet storm, one truth began to settle across audiences, headlines, and households alike. She hadn't just responded to the moment, she had rewritten it. Jasmine Crockett didn't simply walk onto that stage and hold her ground. She redrew the map. In a place built for laughter, distraction, and easy applause, she didn't play along. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't crack. She stood still, spoke clearly, and in doing so, didn't just take control of the stage. She redefined what the stage meant. It was no longer a place for scripted entertainment. For one unforgettable night, it became something else. A courtroom without walls, a pulpit without a church, a battlefield without a single weapon. Only words. But those words carried more weight than any performance that came before or after. She proved something that night, something that even the brightest studio lights couldn't wash away. That lived experience is louder than sarcasm. That pain, when spoken with truth and purpose, will always outlast the laughter meant to silence it. The media machine can cut, edit, laugh, and twist, but it cannot bend the truth when the person speaking has lived it. And Jasmine didn't speak like someone who memorized facts. She spoke like someone who carried them in her bloodstream. Every number she cited, every example she gave, every family she mentioned, they weren't part of a strategy. They were part of her. That's what made it different. That's what made it real. She wasn't there to entertain. She wasn't there to win a debate. She was there to remind everyone watching on that stage, in that audience, and across the country, that dignity is not up for sale, that the truth may be mocked, delayed, or ignored. But when it's delivered by someone who has walked through it, it can't be dismissed. And she reminded the media, clever, fast-moving, always ready for the next click, that the most dangerous voice isn't the loudest. It's the one that doesn't need to be amplified to be remembered. And when the laughter faded, when the hot lights cooled, when the studio emptied and the hashtags began to slow, there was only one thing left standing: respect. It was quiet. It wasn't announced. It didn't trend. But it lingered. It stayed. Because something about what Jasmine had done couldn't be undone. The audience may not have agreed with everything she said. They may not have even liked it. But they heard it, and they respected it. Not because it was polished, but because it was true. That kind of presence is rare. That kind of courage is dangerous. Not to the public, but to the systems that rely on distraction to avoid accountability. Jasmine had walked into a room meant to control the narrative, and left having shattered it, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with something far more radical: calm defiance. She didn't play the part they expected. She played no part at all. She was herself, completely, unapologetically, and unshakably. Even Jimmy Kimmel, for all his years commanding that stage, had never faced someone who didn't flinch at his jokes, didn't bend to his rhythm, and didn't give him the final word. Jasmine didn't take a stage. She removed the ceiling from it. She turned a set built for control into a space for confrontation, and made truth feel like the most dangerous thing in the room. In homes across the country, people rewatched her final moments. The mic drop without volume. The line, "This stage doesn't define me. Action does." Echoing not like a slogan, but like a warning shot. She wasn't asking to be understood. She was declaring where she stood. And in doing so, she forced everyone else to decide whether they were going to keep laughing or start listening. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for millions who have been talked over, misrepresented, cut out of the conversation. For the mother who works 3 jobs and still skips dinner so her kids can eat. For the veteran who comes home to a broken system and is met with more paperwork than help. For the factory worker who gets blamed for a policy they never voted on. She didn't claim their pain. She didn't weaponize it, she honored it. And that's what made the moment unforgettable. In politics, in media, in culture, people often say the truth needs a stage. But Jasmine proved something more dangerous. The truth doesn't need a stage at all. It just needs someone willing to carry it, to live it, and to speak it when the lights are hot, the crowd is hostile, and the pressure is high. And when that happens, no camera can distort it. No edit can erase it. No laugh track can drown it out. Long after the tweets stop, long after the headlines turn, people will remember the way she stood, the way she spoke, and the way she walked away, not to escape the moment, but to complete it. Jasmine didn't storm off. She didn't perform victory. She closed a chapter with the same strength she opened it, with truth in her voice and purpose in her step. And maybe that's what hit hardest. That in an age of constant noise, Jasmine Crockett proved that the most powerful thing a person can do is speak with nothing to prove. But once the noise died down, once the cameras stopped rolling, and the hashtags gave way to the next headline, what lingered was something deeper, something no ratings chart could measure. It wasn't just a moment, it was a message. And it came with a lesson we all needed to hear. The human lesson in Jasmine Crockett's story didn't come wrapped in slogans or applause. It came in the silence after she spoke, in the stillness after she walked off that stage. It came in the way people from different states and different lives looked at their screens and didn't see a politician. They saw themselves. They saw someone refusing to be ridiculed for caring, someone standing tall not for power, but for people. The lesson was this: truth matters more when it's lived, and dignity is most powerful when it's tested. Jasmine faced not just one man's sarcasm, but an entire system built to reward mockery over meaning. And still, she didn't bend. She didn't fight dirty. She fought real. That's what made it unforgettable. That's what made it human. Because here's the thing. This wasn't just about politics. It wasn't just about a late-night show or a trending clip. It was about the way we treat each other when no one is watching. It was about the way we've normalized laughing at pain we don't feel. How we've let media turn struggle into sound bites and real people into background noise. Jasmine didn't speak to impress. She didn't perform. She showed up fully, scars and all, and said, "You will not turn my people into your punchline." And that kind of truth, raw, lived in, steady, isn't just brave, it's rare. And it reminds us what courage looks like when there's nothing left to gain but self-respect. Her story challenges every one of us to ask, when was the last time we stood up for something that didn't benefit us directly? When was the last time we stayed calm under pressure? Not because it was easy, but because we knew who we were. Jasmine's lesson wasn't just in what she said, it was in how she said it. No shouting, no drama, just truth. And in today's world, that's revolutionary. We live in a time where being loud is often mistaken for being strong, where opinions drown out facts, and where performance gets rewarded more than principle. But Jasmine flipped that script. She reminded us that being unshakable isn't about yelling. It's about not backing down when the moment tries to rewrite you. And for those who've been overlooked, misunderstood, or mocked just for being real, Jasmine gave them something they haven't had in a long time: validation. She proved that it's okay to be serious when others joke, that it's okay to care when the world shrugs, that it's okay to speak plainly when everyone else is spinning. And most importantly, she proved that you don't need to be invited to take up space. You deserve to take up space, not because of your title, but because of your truth. There's a quiet revolution happening beneath the surface of her story, a shift from noise to meaning, from flash to foundation. And the human lesson is simple but fierce. Never let anyone laugh you out of your voice. Never let a crowd, a camera, or a system convince you that your truth is too much. Because the moment you choose to stand fully in what you believe, not just say it, but live it, you stop being a character in someone else's script. You become the author of your own. That's what Jasmine did, and that's what we all must learn to do. Not just for a moment, but for a lifetime. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.